I wanted to share with you something from a book that I wrote some years ago called, but it's still one of my very favorites. The book is titled "What Would Jefferson Do? A Return to Democracy," and what I did in this book, first of all, I'd spent like 2 years reading Thomas Jefferson's autobiography, his papers, his letters, his personal diaries, all this, this stuff. And we had bought this old house in Vermont, and it had only once has all of his collected writings been published. It was in 1909, a year, the 100th anniversary of his leaving office as President of the United States in 1809. And published by the Thomas Jefferson Society, which came into existence to do this. And they published this 20-volume set of his collected writings. And when we bought this old house in Vermont, we found the set in the attic. It was all, water damaged. It didn't have any, eBay value or anything, but it was readable. And we had sold a business. This was 1997. We had sold an ad agency down in Atlanta on a 7-year buyout to our employees. And we moved to Vermont and basically retired. And I was writing books. We hadn't started the radio show. And so I had a lot of time on my hands. And I just started, I spent 6, 8, 10 hours a day reading Thomas Jefferson. And I got lost inside this guy's brain. I mean, it was just an amazing experience. And I started writing a book about, Jeffersonian democracy in America, and that ended up being, unequal protection, how the corporations rose to power, something that Jefferson worried about but really didn't expect. And then also this book, What Would Jefferson Do?, in which I take on a bunch of the myths about the founders, myths that are typically promoted by right-wingers because it makes it seem like the founders were more right-wing than they actually were. The United States was created as an experiment of the Enlightenment, which at that point in time in the 1770s was only about 100 years old and was already causing all kinds of social ferment in Europe. In Western Europe, there had been already, one revolution, arguably two, but one major revolution in England, in part as a consequence of Enlightenment thinking, from Thomas Hobbes to Jean-Jacques Rousseau to John Locke to Montesquieu it's just a whole variety of these people. And Jefferson was one of the great Enlightenment thinkers, even though it was a century after the Enlightenment arguably kicked off. And America was this incredible experiment of the Enlightenment. And these guys were what today would be called progressives. They called themselves liberals. George Washington said, "I hope I shall ever see increasing liberality in America." And so some of the myths that I puncture, these are actually subheads in the chapters. The chapter number 3, People and Events That Influenced America's Founders. Jefferson encounters ancient wisdom. This is about what he learned from the Indians. Natives of England, Paul de Rapin Taras and the History of England. It's just some fascinating stuff in there. And then When Democracy Failed, this is a whole section on basically how we lost our way after 9/11. And then chapter 5 is called Myths About Democracy in America. It's one of my favorites because each one kind of stands alone and probably should be reprinted as articles or something. Myth: even our founders knew democracies eventually self-destruct. This is attributed to this Scottish economist, and in fact, it's nonsense. He never even said it, in fact. Myth: America was created by rich white men to protect their wealth. Myth: a woman's place is in the home and the founders knew it. Myth: the Republican Party has always been the party of big business and cheap labor. Myth: the founders thought the Constitution was perfect and should never change. Myth: government is an evil entity that's against the people. Myth: the founders and framers were impractical, idealistic, Enlightenment-era dreamers. And, it goes on and on. So let me just take one of these And this is the rich white guy hypothesis, which says that the reason that when James Madison and I think it was 56 other people got together in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 to write the Constitution, they did so in a locked building, and no notes were published from the constitutional deliberations at all by anybody. James Madison kept the records, and he was in the process of editing them for release when he died in, as I recall, the 1840s. And so, it might have been the 1830s. I don't remember exactly when Madison died, but when he died, they had taken an oath to each other that they wouldn't publish the notes from their deliberations at the Constitutional Convention until after the last man had died, because, you know, now everybody thinks it's because, hey, they were a bunch of rich white guys protecting themselves by writing the Constitution. Turns out it was the opposite. They were betraying their class. And they weren't even all that rich. The first millionaire in America after the Revolutionary War was in 1890 in today's dollars. And $1 million is not that much in today's dollars. But in fact, the Kevin Phillips, in his book, Wealth and Democracy, he says, George Washington, one of the richest Americans, was no more than a wealthy squire in British terms. He said the founders and framers were at best what today would be called the upper middle class in terms of lifestyle, assets, and disposable income. And Jefferson died in bankruptcy. Washington died in bankruptcy, or basically broke. They were rich in land, but they were poor in pretty much everything else. And some of the slaveholders were rich in slaves. In fact, they were their primary assets. So anyhow, this fellow, Forrest McDonald, in 1958, went back and looked at the ratifying conventions in state after state to see, was this true, that rich white guys brought this thing into being? And what he found was pretty amazing. For example, in the state of Delaware, almost 77% of the delegates, to ratify the Constitution, were farmers. More than two-thirds of them small farmers with incomes ranging from 75 cents to $5 a week. This is 77% of the people who voted for the Constitution. Slightly more than 23% of the delegates were professional men, doctors, judges, and lawyers. None of them, not a single one, was a merchant, manufacturer, banker, or speculator in Western lands, which were the rich people of the day. Same thing in New Jersey, 64.1% were farmers making less than $5 a week. In Maryland, the opponents of ratification were mostly the lawyers and investors, but the farmers and teachers carried the day. In South Carolina, quote, no fewer than 82% of the debtors and borrowers of paper money in the convention voted for ratification. In New Hampshire, the known farmers in the convention, 68.7% favored ratification. So it turns out, in short form, and then I'll pick up your calls here, that they really well, let me hang on.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
These guys really believed they were creating the world anew, to paraphrase Thomas Paine, and in a good way for everybody.